How's it going? Pretty good. All right, it's 2 o'clock, so let's go ahead and get started. We have fewer students today than we did last time. I think it's raining and the career fair. Also, last class was pretty boring, so hopefully we didn't lose any students. This chapter is, I think, a lot more, well, I would never say exciting, but it's more interesting, I think, than last chapter. Today we'll talk about biases, which is pretty cool, how our thinking can be skewed. We'll talk about group work, which is a very important skill you want to develop before you get your first real job. And some other cool things as well. So a lot of stuff I think today you'll be able to walk away with some good life knowledge. So therefore, I think it'll be more interesting than it was on Tuesday. All right, a few objectives for us today. So we'll discuss what is rational decision making, how do we make rational decisions, and why do we sometimes make irrational decisions. We'll talk about law and ethics and how they play a role in decision making. Evidence and AI also in their role in decision making. We'll do a self-assessment to discover our own decision making style, and then we'll see how that might influence our group work. And last step, we'll talk about barriers to effective decision making, and then decision making within groups. So let's first look at an overview of decision making. This is the 4-step process, another one of our 4-step processes that the book provides. This one's a pretty good one. It's also very simple, but it's often overlooked when we're making important decisions. The 4 steps are identify the problem, think of alternative solutions, evaluate those alternative solutions, and then pick the best one based on your analysis. If you only take away one thing from this chapter, it's that when you're making important decisions, you have to think through them carefully and evaluate all the evidence you have access to. The reason that managers make poor decisions is that they don't either consider the facts or they don't spend the time to reflect on those facts. The book does not mention the FIND model. Have y'all ever heard of the FIND model before? It's very popular. I think the book stole the FIND model and rebranded it so they didn't have to cite the FIND model, but it's the same four-step process. I think it's easier to remember this way if you think of the FIND acronym: figure out the problem, identify solutions, name pros and cons, and then decide on a course of action. That's what FIND stands for. It's the same 4 steps that the book presents as their 4-step process. So as we walk through it, we'll walk through it using the FIND model, but I don't want y'all to think it's a new concept. It's the same thing the book describes. The first step here, our F from FIND, is figure out the problem. The one thing I'll say the FIND model would neglect is that we're not always looking for problems. Sometimes we're looking for opportunities. So when we say figure out the problem, we should also say figure out the problem and or opportunities. Basically, we're looking for something that we can either take advantage of or some threat we can avoid. Another way to think of this is the last 2 chapters we talked about, like getting a lay of the land or assessing the current reality before you start to strategically plan and make decisions. The same thing is true here. So you want to figure out what's the current state of affairs, and that'll sometimes indicate a discrepancy between where we are and where we want to be. That's the problem we want to solve here, or the opportunity we want to take advantage of. The most challenging thing here is to understand the root cause of the problem. A lot of people like to use their knee-jerk reaction and they'll say like, oh, I think the issue here is this. And they don't spend time to think about it. And sometimes they miss the underlying problem. So whatever effort they make to address the situation, it's not going to be effective unless they treat it at the root cause. Does that make sense? Okay, a lot of times the root cause is harder to understand unless you take time to think about it. Let's see if we can think of an example of this. Let's see if we can think of any political examples where there's maybe an underlying cause that's not being addressed by the issue. Let's say crime is an issue. That's a big issue for Chicago. And we say, all right, the problem is we have a lot of crime. So the solution is let's increase police presence. Maybe that'll help. Let's give, I don't know. Let's say let's have increased police presence. That's our solution right away. But then we spend more time thinking about it. We gather some data. We do a research study, perhaps, and we realize that a lot of the issue with crime is related to under-education of certain regions of Chicago. Maybe if we invested money in education, that could solve the problem, and it wouldn't require excessive police presence to resolve crime. I don't know. That's just an example. Okay. All right. So figure out the problem or opportunity. Once you figured out the problem, identify some potential solutions. The important thing here is come up with multiple solutions. A lot of times we have our first reaction that it's like, all right, I want to do this. I think that's going to be a good solution. Even if you have a good solution right away, try to think of some alternatives. That'll give you options to evaluate and discuss with others. The best approach is to involve as many people as possible. So you remember when we talked about strategic planning, we said involve all the managers from across the organization. And we said the benefit was that it gives us a lot of perspectives we can draw on. It also lets people get engaged in the process so they can be more bought into the process. All right, so we come up with a lot of solutions. Now we have to, all right, step 3, name the pros and cons, or evaluate each of our possible solutions to the problem. You can make a strengths and weaknesses chart, whatever you want to do to calculate what are the pros for this solution and the cons, and then how does that compare to the pros and cons for the other options we have available. Something we'll discuss later today is the ethics, feasibility, and effectiveness. So when businesses make solutions or when they decide on solutions to a problem, they have to make sure that it's legal and ethical and it's good for shareholders. We'll use a decision tree in just a few slides, I think. All right, the last thing we'll say here, we'll talk about this as well later today. Using AI to evaluate solutions is becoming increasingly popular because you can just ask AI, like, hey, which of these solutions do you think is best? Using the data and all the best evidence. And that's a very effective solution. Why do you think AI is better finding solutions than we are? The most obvious answer is it's smarter, but in addition to AI being smarter, why is it better at solving problems than humans? Yes, Sophia. Yeah, that's exactly it. So it's more logical. It's not emotional. It's not biased. Well, we assume it's not biased unless the person that wrote the code wrote in some biases in the code. But we assume in general AI is less biased than humans are. All right, we've evaluated our we've evaluated our options, and then we'll decide what's the course of action we think is best. Some really important things here. Plan carefully and be sensitive to those who are effective. Sometimes you pick a solution that is not going to be favorable for everybody. So it's, in a lot of cases, a good idea to communicate the reasons for selecting that solution. So I might say, all right, I know y'all didn't like this proposed solution here, but we're going to go with it. And here are the reasons we're going to go with it. I hope y'all can get on board. Okay. Be decisive. So don't pick a solution and then, have you ever heard the term crawfish? Crawfish? I think it's more popular in the South. I learned it in Louisiana because crawfish is pretty popular down there. But crawfish crawl back into their holes. They crawl backwards. So if you crawfish, you're backing away from your argument because you lost your confidence or you're reversing course. That never looks good if you're indecisive. So pick a solution and stick to it. However, you do want to be attentive to the outcome. So if you pick a solution, be decisive, but also be willing to admit that if it was the wrong course of action. So if you start to get data back that says you made the wrong call, you've got to be willing to admit that sometimes. All right, I have a question for y'all. Let's say you have a decision that includes making layoffs. That's a very unpopular decision. How would y'all make that? How would y'all communicate that sensitively? Yeah, Eric. Like give him pot. What? How would you do that?
Let's say like at first, like say us like
Like be a good person, be nice to them. All right, yeah. Rubaisha? Yeah, I think Arlette agrees. You don't want to post up like, all right, here's the 10 people we're firing this week. If your name's on there, pack your bags. Arlette? Yeah. Yeah. I like that as well. Be sensitive to them. Let them know, hey, I'll give you a reference. I'll do what I can to help you out. I know this sucks, but all right, I like those solutions. Other examples, one thing that I would always do is communicate the necessity of whatever you're doing. That's always a good idea to help sell your plan to others, is to say, like, I know this isn't popular, but we have to do it. Maybe layoffs will prevent us from shutting down the company. So some of us will keep our jobs, but not all of us, unfortunately. Be fair about it. Make sure that we understand these people got laid off because they unfortunately were not performing the best, or maybe they were the most recent hires. There's they call it FIFO, first in, first out. If you're the most recent hire, you'll be the first one to be laid off. And then kind of what Arlette was saying, try to give them something tangible. So either a reference. A lot of times we like to give a compensation severance package. That'll help make them feel a little better at least. Okay, I would say one takeaway from this slide is that sometimes you're going to piss people off with your decisions. Some people will not be happy, but at the end of the day, we have to make decisions, and our best approach is to be fair and transparent and sensitive. Let's talk about this FIND process. We'll also refer to this as the rational decision-making process. So being rational, collecting evidence, making the best decision based on our analysis. There are some underlying assumptions that are not super reasonable in all situations. And here are just 3 examples. So the first is that we're assuming that there's complete information, there's no uncertainty, and if we have access to all this information, we can make very accurate and logical decisions based on the evidence. Another one is that we can be unemotional when we make our assessment of our outcomes. And as we discussed a little while ago, humans are not very good at being unemotional and unbiased when they make decisions. Later on, we'll talk about all the different biases that can affect your judgment. And those are all things that can undermine rational decision making. And then the last is that we're going to be able to make the best decision for the organization. And given the fact that we don't know all possible outcomes, we don't have the best all possible evidence, we can't always be sure that we'll make the best decision. All right, so these are some challenges. The next slide, I'll show you some more discrete or more, well, they're better examples of how these challenges kind of manifest. So there are, what, 7 different hindrances here. We're not going to go through all of them, but I think this is a cool slide. This is also in the book. It's a cool graph that shows us all the different ways that we can experience problems with rational decision making. So just as one example, we mentioned that we don't always have access to all information. Sometimes we have imperfect information, like we're trying to decide, let's say, who to fire between two. Let's say we have 2 new employees. We have to fire one of them because we have to have layoffs. But they've only both been working for a week. We don't really know who's the better employee at this point. So it's going to be a hard decision to make without more evidence. Okay, so that's just one challenge. Here's another one that I think is interesting. Sometimes we have conflicting goals. That was a lot of times the impetus for ethical dilemmas. If we have competing goals or competing values, that means that when we make decisions, we're going to have trade-offs between certain stakeholders. All right. So as we can see, there are a lot of challenges to making effective decisions. What this means for a lot of managers is that they tend to neglect rational decision making, and instead they make irrational or non-rational decisions, and that's what we'll talk about next. All right, so the book discusses kind of 2 flaws that make us prone to engaging in non-rational decisions. The first is this idea of bounded rationality. That's kind of a fancy term that will not be on the midterm. But basically what it means is that we can only be so rational because we have limited access to information. There are a lot of other hindrances that prevent us from making the best decisions. So that's all that means, is that even if we try to be rational, there's limits to that because of certain hindrances. Next up is hubris. Can anybody define hubris? What is hubris? What does it look like? Do you have an idea? Yeah, that's a huge part of it. It's just being prideful. If I say someone is hubristic, I can also say that's a very prideful person. You might think of them as arrogant even. It's a negative trait in humans that makes us prideful. Okay, if I'm a CEO and I'm super hubristic, then I might make a bad decision, but stick to my guns because I think I'm God's gift to the earth and nothing I do is wrong. So I'm never going to backtrack. Okay. All right. So bounded rationality, hubris, these things can lead us to make poor decisions. There are a couple different examples of non-rational decision making. One of them is satisficing. That's a pretty popular term in business. Basically, it means we'll do something that's just good enough, and then we're not going to spend any extra time or effort to try to make it better. Another one is just using your gut, also known as the intuition model. So if we think, all right, I've got a good feeling about this, this has worked for me in the past, so we're going to go with this course of action. Trust me, guys, I have a really good feeling. That would be the intuition model. Well, I'm going to save this question for the next slide. Talk about when might it be better to use a non-rational decision-making process. And to be clear, generally speaking, I didn't put this on the slide because I thought this was obvious. Generally speaking, it's always good to be rational, to gather evidence, to evaluate courses of action. But when might it be better to be non-rational? Like if I want to use my intuition, when could that be beneficial? Sophia? Yeah, that's a really good example. We just don't have the time to go through the whole find process. Like, all right, I need a quick decision right now. I think this is the best thing to do. That's a good time to maybe use your intuition. Any other thoughts? That's probably the best example. All right. First example answer up here. So low stake situations where we need a quick answer. That gets at what Sophia is saying here. And then kind of more broadly, if we don't have access to the resources we need, that could be time or it could be money. It's very popular to hire consultants nowadays, but some businesses don't have the financial capital to hire a consultant to help them make these decisions. So in those situations, they just got to do what they think is best. Then the challenges here, there's a couple. So you have to make a decision based on intuition. What kind of challenge does that present for you as a manager? So if you make a non-rational decision, what kind of challenges are you going to face? Mike? Yeah, if it might be. Yeah, I would say you're not always doing that, but you could be. And you're right. The first thing you said, like you're more prone to criticism. If you make a decision that's non-rational, it's a lot easier for people to say like that was not the best decision to make. And what are you going to say in response to that? You can't be like, well, you just got to trust me. I've got a really good feeling about this. Whereas if you have evidence to back up your decision and then they criticize you, you can say, well, you know what? I know you don't like this decision, but the evidence suggests it was the best decision. Something else to think about is that if we make non-rational decisions, we're more prone to bias. The evidence will help us overcome our biases when we're making decisions, and we'll get more into detail with that later. All right, move on. Let's talk about ethics and how ethics plays a role in making decisions. We'll use a nice little decision tree. Help us out. All right, so some interesting stats from the book for us to understand the importance of ethical decision making here. They've done a lot of research and found that the number one reason that CEOs are getting fired or laid off is because they make unethical decisions. We can also see that it's growing in trend. So in 2008, this light blue was very low. This is unethical behavior, and it's just grown and grown until 2018. It was the most common reason for CEOs to be let go, was making unethical decisions. All right. Let's look at a ethical decision-making tree that we can use. With this decision tree, we're going to ask ourselves 4 questions, or rather 3 questions. First off, if we're going to make a course of action, if we're going to decide on one, is it legal to do so? Like, is what we're doing illegal? If it is, we're not going to do it. If it is legal, then we'll ask ourselves, does it maximize shareholder value? And then last, we'll ask ourselves, is it ethical to do this action? If we say no to any of these questions, like, is it legal, ethical, or good for shareholders, then we should not do it. This is what the tree looks like. I like this, kind of like this image. It shows us, we ask ourselves the first question, is it legal? If it's not legal, don't do it. If it is, then we see, does it maximize shareholder value? If no, yeah, probably don't do it. So usually we're only doing an action if we can say yes to these questions. But my question for y'all is, can you think of a situation where you might want to do something that's either illegal or bad for shareholders, but you think is the ethical thing to do? Can y'all think of any examples like that? So maybe we said no to these first 2 questions. It's illegal and it doesn't maximize shareholder value, but I think it's the right thing to do. Connor?
Will help to do the management statement, maybe change the windows.
Like cooking the books. Yeah. Yeah. That one would be great for shareholders if we can cook the books. Do you know what that means? Like fudge the financials to make it look like we're doing better. That's good for shareholders, but it is immoral. At least Cotter thinks it's immoral. Some of y'all might think it is. It is definitely illegal. One example I was thinking of was whistleblowing. If you think about people like Edward Snowden who whistleblow, what they did was clearly illegal and bad for a lot of stakeholders. But some would say that's the ethical thing to do, despite the legal and shareholder norms here. All right, my only point of asking that question is that I want y'all to get stuck in this mindset that legal always trumps shareholder value and shareholder value always trumps ethical. Your personal values will dictate which of these questions you emphasize more. But in general, we want to make sure that we're being legal, beneficial for shareholders, and also ethical. All three is best. Last thing I'll say about this tree is that if you are discussing ethics in your group project, this is something that'd be really good to reference. So when you're evaluating a company's ethical decision-making, you could say, for example, they made an unethical decision. What we recommend they should have done instead is they should have followed this ethical decision tree and then cite the book and then say, the ethical decision tree says you should ask yourself these 3 questions. That'd be a great way to apply book information to your group project. All right, let's look at an example here. Here's an example for y'all about Alembic. Alembic is a pharmaceutical company. They make blood pressure drugs. When Alembic's competitors were forced to recall their blood pressure medicine, the company took the opportunity to increase its price by 320%. So their competitors had to take their product off the market. That gave Alembic kind of a monopoly. So they tripled their prices. They took advantage of their monopoly and raised prices. All right, so let's ask ourselves these 3 questions. The first 2 are pretty obviously yes, it's legal to raise prices. It is great for shareholders because now they're tripling their profits, but is it ethical? So what do y'all think? Is it ethical to increase prices in this situation? All right, Rabisha says no. Would anybody want to argue yes, it was ethical to raise prices? Nobody? Some other people saying no too. All right, I would agree with y'all. This is pretty unethical, but I want to pose a follow-up here. What if Alembic said, like, all right, I know, we know y'all, this is expensive. We're making a lot of money off this, but we're going to use the extra profits to research and cure cancer. What if they're able to cure cancer with the profits? Would it be ethical then? Some of y'all still say no. Connor? Yeah. Connor says no, that's not moral. People still might die if they need the blood pressure medicine but can't afford it. Would y'all still say no? Or would anybody say yes, this is ethical? All right, just curious. If you wanted to make an argument that it is, you could say, well, if you want to sound really smart, you'll say, according to the consequentialist perspective, and then you would say, if there are more lives saved from cancer medicine and less lives lost from the overpriced blood pressure medicine, at the end of the day, more people lived, and this was the ethical decision. That is, the ends justify the means. I would probably agree with y'all that it's still not okay to penalize the people that need the blood pressure medicine because their life is just as valuable and we shouldn't sacrifice them to keep alive the cancer patients. But I think that's a good example of how you might have a different perspective if you think that the greater good is more important. All right, let's keep going. Let's talk about evidence-based decision-making. All right, this is a very, very good quote. This came straight from the book. But a couple things I want to emphasize here. So these people, Pfeffer and Sutton, these are very popular management scholars. They say that too many companies and too many leaders are more interested in just copying others, doing what they've always done and making decisions based on beliefs and what ought to work rather than what actually works. They fail to face the hard facts and use best evidence to help navigate the competitive environment. So the main thing here is that we're not using best evidence, and we're using, in other words, non-rational decision-making. So copying others, doing what we've always done, doing what our gut tells us ought to work, those are all non-rational decisions, and they're advocating for gathering information, looking at the hard facts, and then making evidence-based decisions. All right, so let's take a look at how that might look, make an evidence-based decision. A couple things we need to do to be evidence-based: prioritize facts over feelings. I think Sophia said earlier, humans are emotional. And if we let emotions cloud our judgment, we're not going to make decisions based on facts. Some strategies we can use: we can see our organization as an outsider. So try to take someone else's perspective and think, like, how does the general public view my company if I make this decision? How would they respond to that? You can treat your organization as an unfinished prototype. Basically, there's always room for improvement. Don't be satisfied, and be willing to experiment, learn from failure, and stop bad practices. That's probably the hardest thing to do, is to stop bad practices, because if we've done something for a while, it's safe to keep doing it. But imagine you're a new manager and you come in and you say, all right, the way we've done things is bad. We need to do it a different way. There's a lot of pressure on you to make sure that that is successful, because people will, they want to keep doing things the way they've done it. That's easy. And it's risky to change things up. Okay. One key takeaway here is that if you use the evidence and make smart decisions, you can change things up and still be successful. All right. So what makes it hard to be evidence-based? These are all things we mentioned so far. We don't have enough evidence. Sometimes evidence is bad. Sometimes people lie to you, and sometimes you lie to yourself. That's the one that's the hardest to understand, is when you're lying to yourself because maybe you're really emotionally invested in a certain course of action. All right, let's look at data analytics. How can data help us make better decisions? This is underlined, so it might be good to know for the midterm. Data analytics is the process of analyzing raw data in order to make conclusions about information they contain. So it's the best way to convert data into decisions. Increasingly, we're using special software to analyze data. There are people whose their only job is to analyze data. So for example, Netflix has positions where they hire someone just to develop machine learning algorithms to understand our viewing history, and then use that data to make recommendations for us. The same is true for TikTok and Instagram, and Facebook. They use algorithms to kind of scan your viewing history and then present data that they think you're going to find interesting or engage with. All right, when it becomes big, we call it big data. That's the formal term for data that's very big. Data that's so vast that a conventional database can't handle it. This is, if we're thinking about on the level of a massive organization like Coca-Cola, for example. Coca-Cola has those drink dispensers, where you select, like, I want Coke and then I want vanilla. That's my favorite, vanilla Coke. Where you can pick different options and then it dispenses it. They can use those machines and then track the selection. Maybe they're looking at the selection within America, and they can say that, all right, in Southern America, they tend to prefer cherry Coke. So let's put more cherry Coke down there. And in New England, they like vanilla Coke. So we'll put that up there. Okay. It can also be used for public policy. So governments can use this data to inform legislation. And we can also use it as a business to meet customer needs and improve production efficiency. All right, so big data is great. A lot of the hard parts to it are collecting it and then knowing how to analyze it. Let's take a look at AI. AI is, like we said, an increasing option used for analyzing data. So we'll talk about types of AI, benefits and drawbacks of AI. Okay. So we can use AI to automate business processes, for data analysis, and for engaging customers and employees. We've talked about a couple of these already. For example, TikTok and Instagram, their feeds are customized based on your history of scrolling and liking and sharing reels. It's also used by companies like Google. So Google can analyze where everyone's at in the world that has an Android phone and has their location turned on. And they can show that there's traffic on Lakeshore Drive. And that's going to increase your commute by 5 minutes. So that data is really useful if those organizations can use it effectively. All right, some of the benefits. One of the main benefits is that it can help us automate jobs that are otherwise tedious or boring for humans. It can also save companies a lot of money by allowing them to automate away certain jobs that they're paying hourly pay. So if you think about McDonald's, for example, McDonald's in the past 5 years has had more kiosks where you just go up and order your food, and they have less people behind the counter who are taking your order for you. And so that saves McDonald's a ton of money in labor. The drawback, though, is that those jobs are no longer jobs for people to work. Okay. All right. So a few drawbacks here. The first is implementation. So training AI is difficult. Okay. There are also ethical concerns with training AI, making sure that AI is unbiased and makes rational decisions. Data integration is difficult. If you have big data, for example, managing that data is very difficult to do so. And then it's also very expensive. So if I am a bagel shop, I don't have the resources to invest in AI or big data. I'm just going to use a lot of probably non-rational decisions in terms of how to run my business. I'll give you one example so the company I worked for in Louisiana was a pool management company. And we had like 25 facilities across the state. And every 15 minutes, the staff would do a head count and they'd say like, all right, there's 20 people in the pool, 5 people on deck. And we can track throughout the day when people are there and when people are not there. And at the end of each season, we'd go to a lot of times they're country clubs, and we would say, y'all could open 2 hours later every Sunday because no one's there in the morning. They're all at church. And then on Friday nights, there's always 50 people here at close. So maybe we extended an hour. So they were very appreciative of that data because then they could adjust the hours of operation based on what the customers actually want or when they actually use it. Okay. All right, question for y'all. So what are some concerns with AI? I mentioned one already. So layoffs is a concern. What are some others? Do y'all have any personal concerns about AI? Eric? Yeah, so there's definitely less jobs available because they're being automated away. Do y'all have any other concerns? Yeah, Narelli? Yeah, it can't always be trusted. That's definitely true. Did you have a thought? Yeah. Did y'all see there was a lawyer who used ChatGPT for a case they were working, and they cited a bunch of cases that were actually made up cases. So that was really embarrassing for them. It's also scary to think that we can make decisions based on fabricated data. So if we're using AI, we need to make sure that it's verified. Other concerns? One we didn't mention is weaponization. Have y'all seen the Avengers? I forget which Avengers movie it was, but there's this thing in the sky that can shoot people that are bad people. And they say, we're going to solve crime across the world because our thing is going to target people who are about to commit crimes and just take them out. So that's a pretty scary thought. All right. Let's move on. This is the fun part, I think. We'll talk about some decision-making biases. There are 10 of them. You do not need to know the names of any of these biases, so don't worry about trying to memorize them. But what I think is interesting is to see all the different forms of how our thinking can be skewed. All right, so let's go through these pretty quickly here. First up is availability bias. That's using only readily available information to make decisions, such as recent memory. You might have experienced this when you're driving on the road. You see someone get pulled over by a cop, and then you think, oh, I'm at risk of being pulled over, so no, I'll drive slower for the next 5 miles. That's a result of the availability bias. Representativeness bias, faulty generalization from a small sample or single event. Confirmation bias is probably the one we're most familiar with. If you only read your Facebook feed and you get your news off Facebook, that's very bad. Because we just talked about how Facebook shows you things that they think you want to see. So if you are very political on Facebook and you only get certain political news stories showed to you, that's going to reinforce your kind of one-track mind thought process related to politics. So we like to hear things that confirm our beliefs, but you should challenge yourself sometimes. All right, sunk cost. So if we've spent money, we spent a lot of money, we don't want to give up on something that we've invested a lot of time and resources into, like your dessert. You spent 15 bucks on this creme brulee, so you're not gonna not finish it. You're just gonna keep eating, even if you're miserable. You should avoid that. Anchoring adjustment bias. This one's super important for y'all if you're negotiating a salary. The anchor is the first number that's suggested, and that tends to skew all the numbers that come after that. So if you're, let's say, you're looking for $70,000, that'd be a pretty good starting salary right out of college. And they ask you, what's your desired salary? First thing you should do is not give them an answer. Don't answer that question. You should flip it back on them and say, well, what range did y'all have in mind? Because what they're hoping you'll do is they're hoping that you'll undershoot yourself and they'll be able to pay you less. So maybe you get nervous. You're like, 70 is too much. 50? And that's a win for them. They're like, oh, yeah, we were going to pay you 55. So that's good news for you. So try to make them give the first number. And if they really want to be stubborn, then say a high number. The worst they can do is say no. Okay. But just be aware that that first thing that's said tends to anchor the rest of the discussion. All right. Here's some others. Overconfidence bias, being blind to what we don't know. Be willing to admit you don't know something, and also don't be super confident if you don't know everything about what it is you're talking about. All right, hindsight bias. This one we're also probably pretty familiar with. Hindsight is 20/20 is a very common phrase, at least in America. When we reflect on things, it's easy to say like, oh, I should have known that all along. Framing bias. If you're selling a plan to your organization, let's say you're the leader, the way that you frame your plan is super important. So in this example, this is like a surgeon talking to a patient. If I say there's a 90% chance of survival, that sounds pretty good. But if I say there's a 10% chance of mortality, that sounds worse. Even though it's the same numbers, framing it in a positive light will help sell your message easier. All right, escalation of commitment. This is pretty similar to sunk cost. Like the more we get committed to a decision, the less we're likely to reverse course or admit that we were wrong. And then last, categorical thinking. So sorting information into buckets. This can lead us to have prejudices against, let's say, I grew up in rural America, population of 1,000 people, and it's all white. And I met one black person in my hometown growing up, and that person was mean. And I moved somewhere else, and I think all black people are mean because I met one person who was mean. So be willing to accept the fact that you can't make gross generalizations, and you should be open to new information that can disconfirm your bias. All right, that's good. That's a lot of interesting biases, but one of our takeaways is how do we avoid those? So it's a question for y'all. What are some ways we can overcome biases? Baisha? Yeah, definitely prioritize facts over feelings. That's a great method. Any other thoughts? Mike? Get more people involved? Yeah, I like it. Yeah, that's a great idea. So if y'all didn't hear that, just getting more people involved in this process. His rationale was that maybe I have a bias, but if I involve Mike, maybe he can recognize my bias. We can help each other stay objective. That's cool. I like that. All right, so some other options here. Well, be brutally self-honest, one that's sometimes difficult. This is a new term, I think. I don't think we've discussed this before, counterfactual thinking. Have y'all heard of that before? No. All right. So counterfactual thinking is an exercise where you ask yourself, believe one thing, I'm super confident that this is the right thing to do. But what if it was the wrong thing to do? Like, is it possible that I'm wrong? If you can do that, then you can sometimes see past biases that were skewing your initial decision. All right. And then getting at what Mike said here, ask for an outsider's perspective. That's always good advice if you're unsure about something or you think maybe I'm being subjective here. Let me ask someone else for their assessment of my thought process. All right. Let's move on. We'll talk about group decision making next. A lot of cool things here, I think. We'll talk about advantages and disadvantages for group decision making, groupthink, which is a disadvantage to group decision making, and then how to make better group decisions in groups. All right, so some advantages and disadvantages. On the pros, being in a group to make decisions gives us more access to knowledge, more access to perspectives, this intellectual stimulation. We can challenge each other on ideas. We can recognize each other's biases. There's a better understanding of decision rationale. And if everyone's invested, then there's more commitment from the group. We've talked about already that if you involve people in a process, then they're more committed to see that process through. That's especially true for group decision. The downside, it's not always best to make group decisions because they can be slower. We might need time to deliberate things, and that can really slow down the process. Sometimes people can dominate group decisions. The group can also engage in groupthink. We'll discuss that more on the next slide, but can someone real quick define groupthink or tell us what that looks like? So what does groupthink look like? Norelli? I've never heard, I'm not familiar with that, but it sounds. Yes, we tend to like all think as one, and it's easier for us to go with whatever the group's saying because then we don't have to like take a stand for our beliefs. We're not risking opposing anybody. But yeah, we make a decision as a group, and it's hard when we get into groupthink mode. It's hard to challenge the group, even if the group is wrong. So that is definitely a downside. Satisficing, we've talked about that, making a decision that is just okay. And then goal displacement. So that means the group is dysfunctional and we can't make progress on our goal because maybe we're fighting. The goal was displaced. Let's talk more about group. So as Norelli mentioned, how it manifests is the group all making this decision together. It can be a result of a group that's super friendly. So maybe we're all best friends. We don't want to disagree. The problem is that it makes it very challenging for us to admit that we're doing the wrong thing or think about ways we can improve what we're doing as a group. So in general, we want to avoid it. So the question is, how do we avoid it? The book gave a few examples for avoiding groupthink, but y'all might have your own ideas. So how can we avoid groupthink? Connor?
You know, just in our opinions.
Allow critics? Yes. That can be challenging, but if we create some process for criticism, that can allow us to recognize the group is making the wrong decision.
Practice to-
Yes, that's super important. Listen to people. That's something that I would say is a weakness for many of us. When we're in a discussion, we like to just wait our turn to speak our piece. Someone's talking, we're like, all right, I can't wait for them to finish because I got something to say. Man, they're going to love this. And then we don't even listen to what the person's saying. You got to listen and make the conversation a two-way street. The same is true for within groups. All right, I like this. Thanks, Cutter. The things the book recommends, in addition to that, one that's super useful is before you start the group discussion, let people think independently. Because what we like to do is the first good idea we hear, we like to latch onto it, like, oh yeah, I like that idea. But if we think independently, then we have different thoughts that are brought to the table when we start the group discussion, and we can compare and contrast those different ideas. Carter mentioned have a space for criticism. That's what devil's advocate is. You can designate somebody to challenge the ideas. And it's kind of like in your high school debates where you have to debate the opposing view, even if you don't believe it. Sometimes that's devil's advocate role, is to challenge the group, even if they think the group idea is correct. Just by doing that, we can sometimes think about criticisms we hadn't previously thought about towards our idea. So we'll see some weaknesses we hadn't thought about already. All right. I'll say as a leader, one thing that we've talked about in previous, like, how do we facilitate this? A lot of the answers, the one common answer is model and incentivize the things we want to see. So like ethics, the same is true for this. So if you're leading a group, be willing to like admit your idea wasn't the best, be willing to facilitate others sharing ideas in a civil way. That's going to go a long way as well. All right. Some characteristics of effective group decision-making. So in general, group decisions are less efficient. That doesn't mean they're less effective, right? Remember, efficiency is about speed and minimal resources. Groups can be less efficient just by the nature of having to debate or have this discussion about their ideas. But they can also make more effective decisions if they're able to avoid groupthink, share ideas in a civil manner. The size of the group does affect decision quality. There's a lot of research on this. If the group is too large, that can lead to lower decision qualities. And they suggest this range of 7 to 10, but that's very context specific. So as an example, y'all's group size for the projects for this class is 7 or 8, and I think that's too big. I would prefer to have group sizes of like 3 to 5. Unfortunately, there's 68 of y'all, and we can't have 20 groups presenting. So in organizations, what you're looking at is how many people does it take to complete this project? And if you're putting too many people on it, you're going to have inefficiencies. Of course, if you put too few people on it, then that's too much for them to take on. All right. Let's look at some do's and don'ts. Crowder actually mentioned this one. Use active listening skills to help reach consensus within groups. That's great. Get as many people involved as possible. We'll hear a bunch of different ideas if everyone's chiming in. And seek out reasons and facts, not emotions and intuition. Some don'ts. Don't try to use negotiation and vote counting as the ultimate means for making decisions. Sometimes we have to take a vote. Sometimes we'll say like, all right, we can't make a decision. Let's take a vote. But what happens to the minority group when they don't get their way? How are they going to feel? Yeah, they're not going to like that. In general, if we force it to a vote without having a thorough discussion and addressing their concerns, then they're going to have a pretty negative reaction. So as much as possible, try to get people to understand each other, come to a consensus that will dissatisfy as few people as possible. And then as a very last resort, only as a last resort, should you put things to a vote. Okay. We got 2 more slides on group problem solving. That's a lot of information here. We'll talk about brainstorming, dialectic method, and the next slide, postmortems. So brainstorming is very effective for overcoming groupthink, or really it's about preventing groupthink. If we brainstorm, we let everyone share ideas, but the important thing is that before we share ideas, they think independently so they can have their own thoughts. And then once everyone's had their own thoughts, then we say them out loud and we evaluate them based on merit. We make sure everyone has a fair hearing for their idea. That allows us to have a lot of different perspectives be considered for our decision. The dialectic method is pretty similar to devil's advocate because we have 2 sides debating their suggested course of action. The best example is the US court system. We have, if you want to use technical jargon, the thesis and the antithesis or antithesis, and they're debating their points. The main idea is that they're debating their points by presenting facts. So they say, all right, group 1, show us why you think we should do this, make this decision. And they say, all right, for all these reasons, we should do this. And we say, all right, thanks, group 1. Group 2, why do y'all think we should do something else? And then we debate the merits of each argument and decide which one's the best. All right. If you forget the terms dialectic method and devil's advocate, that's okay. Just know that it's good to have opposing ideas be presented and considered. All right, last thing here is this idea called project postmortem. And all it is we reflect as a group after we've completed our group work, and we think about what did we do well, what could we do better, and if we're preparing for a subsequent group project, like, all right, we finished this one, now we're gonna move on to the next. What can we apply from the first one to the second one to make it better? There's a lot of research on this. It shows that it makes you more productive. If a team works together over the course of time, if they do multiple projects together, they tend to get better if they reflect between projects on what they can improve. That kind of makes sense, right? It makes the team more cohesive, gives them closure on the task that they just completed, and then it can improve morale if you celebrate success. So sometimes we're reflecting as a team to say, like, oh man, we really sucked it up there. We got to do better next time. And sometimes we're saying, like, that was great, guys. That was awesome. So let's celebrate and let's also see what we can apply for the next go around to continue our success. If you are a leader within organizations, something you can do to be really effective as a leader is to facilitate these postmortems, because teams don't do this naturally. Very few teams will come together as a group afterwards and reflect on things. So a leader's a good person to instigate that process. All right. We are going to, real quick, we'll talk about, well, we're going to do this self-assessment on decision-making, but I want to go over some of the broad ideas first, then we'll take the assessment, and then we'll reflect after. But we're going to look at what is our decision-making style. They are, for the purposes of today, 4, and they're going to be based on these 2 factors. So they'll be based on your value orientation and your tolerance for ambiguity. Excuse me. So your value orientation is, do you care more about tasks and technical concerns, or do you care more about people and social concerns? And then second, are you very tolerant for ambiguity, or are you intolerant? Ambiguity, if you're not familiar with the term, is just like, how much uncertainty can I tolerate? Some people, also known as type A individuals, like my wife is very type A, and she wants to know like everything that's going on, how it's going to work. And other people are okay with things being very flexible and spur of the moment. All right, so when you take the self-assessment, you'll figure out where you lie on those 2 dimensions and what kind of decision-making style you have. This is a 2x2 matrix that we can use to determine our decision-making style. Let's say we're high on tolerance for ambiguity, we're okay with ambiguity, and we value people over tasks. That means we're the conceptual style. And we'll talk about what that means in a second. It's going to tell you what you are by default. You don't have to use this 2x2 matrix. I just wanted to explain that. So let's go ahead and complete our self-assessment, and then we'll discuss the results afterwards. Anybody need more time with this? All right. Wasn't always that way though. So I wasn't always that way. All right, let's go ahead and discuss this. We'll discuss the results of these. So I know I gave y'all some reading, said that you're higher in this category. Here's what this means. But I want to walk through these real briefly, just so we have an understanding of all the four decision-making styles. So the first was directive. If we are intolerant of ambiguity and we have higher prioritization of tasks, we're this. We're efficient, logical, practical, systematic, action-oriented. The downside that we need to be aware of is that we can be autocratic and controlling. Those are synonymous, essentially. So we might try to dominate the decisions. We might try to take control of things, but we need to realize that sometimes we have to step back and let the group also contribute. Analytical styles next. So we're tolerant, focus on tasks. We like to consider all facts and make careful decisions. Respond well to new and uncertain situations, and the downside is we might overanalyze situations. I would say I'm in this quadrant. I like to overanalyze things, but that sometimes means that I don't make decisions when I should. I meant to ask. Let's go back to the first one. Who was directive? Just by show of hands. If you're interested in sharing. Nobody? All right, Khadijah? Anybody analytical? All right, a few more of those. Let's talk about conceptual next. So we're tolerant of ambiguity, focus on people. We like to utilize intuition, encourage discussions and consensus, and find creative solutions. The downside is they might also be indecisive. Who in here is a conceptual style? All right, cool. Then the last is behavioral, intolerant of ambiguity and prioritization of people. They're very warm and supportive. They are, in the team, they're the person that's going to help try to bridge conflict, be an uplifter. The potential downside is that they will shy away from conflict and can sometimes be wishy-washy. So rather than confronting an issue, they might just say like, oh, all right, guys, let's not talk about this. Who in here is a behavioral? Cool. All right, very cool. Couple things that are really good to know, or some good takeaways here, are that if we know our own decision-making style, we can be reflective of that. Also, if we understand how other people make decisions, that'll allow us to collaborate better. If I understand that you're directive and I'm conceptual or something else, then I'll recognize why sometimes you're talking more than I am. If you're the directive person, you can sometimes recognize that and take a step back and say, maybe I shouldn't talk so much. Let's give someone else a chance. Or if you're someone who's wishy-washy, I need to take a stand here. Like I need to get over that weakness of me being that type. So it helps you a lot if you can just recognize that and overcome some of the downsides there. What I wanted to do was do a group meeting. I don't think we're gonna have time for that, but some things you should consider with your group. How do your styles either clash or mesh to make your group work more cohesively or less cohesively? And how can y'all complement each other's style? So that's something y'all can reflect on in your own group time. Let's talk real quick. I have attendance in a couple slides, but there are a couple cool things here in this career competency model. So let's try to have like Give me 45 more seconds of focus, and then we'll do the attendance. So some things for us to make better decisions as managers. Try to recognize your biases, use those processes we discussed to overcome those, such as counterfactual thinking. That's a super useful strategy. Probably the most important thing I can stress to you is reflect on past decisions. That can also help you recognize your biases. Like, hey, I thought this, but then in reality, that wasn't how I expected it to be. So now I'm going to update my thought process about whatever that was. Okay. Use a decision methodology such as the FIND model. Seems very simple, but a systematic process like that will help you make better decisions. And then when you interview, try to flex your knowledge and name drop some of these concepts like the FIND model. All right, that's it for today. Thanks for being here. Have a good weekend. I'll see you all next Tuesday. Don't forget to submit your case analysis tonight. There have been more and more y'all forgetting that. Submit your case analysis by midnight. All right, have a good weekend, y'all. Yep. That's the homework on Connect.